Okay. Two women influenced by Elizabeth Fry. Elizabeth Saunders. Read about the work of Elizabeth Fry. It's confusing when they're both Elizabeths. She read about her work in the Christian Observer, an important magazine set out by the Clapham sect. And Saunders started reading the Bible with a young woman, a 16-year-old, the daughter of a cement manufacturer, nonconformist. And she started reading the Bible with this young woman, Ellen. Born in 1810. Ellen was born in 1810. Elizabeth Saunders led her young friend Ellen to Jesus. And together they were drawn into this new imaginative economy that they were reading about. They got excited, so they started going to visit poorer people in their neighborhood, telling them about Jesus, bringing them food, doing pretty much whatever they could do to help. Perhaps they were overzealous, but while they were out and about, these two girls, Elizabeth Saunders and Ellen Ranyard, caught a fever. It turned out to be scarlet fever, and Elizabeth Saunders died. Ellen Ranyard recovered. But for years, Ellen Ranyard lived with the guilt of losing her friend, the guilt that she had survived when her friend, who was also her mentor, had died. Racked by grief. And that grief immobilized her. She stopped. And actually, disappointment and the sense of being alone can immobilize us, can't it? It can cause us to move back and move away. In 1839, Ellen married. She only had 4 children compared to Fry's 11, so it was quite easy. She even had time to write some books. She wrote books about mission. She wrote books about Bible mission. She gave as much money as she could to Bible mission. But actually, she just edged back from the front line herself. This grief that she was carrying. In 1857, they moved to London, the family, and Ellen became painfully aware of the needs all around her. Let me put a picture. This is one of the famous Gustave Doré images of London in this period. London, between 1815 and 1860, the city tripled in size. That's just pretty much in Ellen's lifetime. That's extraordinary statistic. By 1851, about 30% of Londoners were born elsewhere. There were immigrants from Ireland as a result of the potato famine. There were German, Spanish refugees fleeing tumult of revolution on the continent, but there were also Indian and African sailors, and rural dwellers were literally flooding into the cities. Increasingly, agriculture was no longer a possible means of subsistence with the mechanization of agriculture, and the cities were crammed. You're familiar with this story. Sewage crisis, poor water, terrible houses with poor ventilation. And then the cities being carved across by the beginnings of the railways in 1840, mapping the social geography, segregating the cities by social class. Nice middle-class suburbs with poverty squashed into urban cores. And these emerging urban centers were causing unprecedented anxiety. They were causing, as it were, theological reinterpretation. Existential poetry, not technically existential, but existential in terms of bleak, desperate, bewildered. And here's Ranyard in the middle of it, feeling the extent and the weight of this change all around her. But what she sees is not only an urban crisis, she also sees a different kind of crisis in the church. She sees churchmen competing with one another for souls. She sees churches that no longer, even if they were filled, have enough provision to meet the needs of the urban people anyway. And she sees a structure so well suited to the rural structures of the parish creaking at the seams. Literally, I think that's a good image, just like you can see the seams bulging and about to burst. And Ranyard sees middle-class churchmen more concerned with getting people into the churches than dealing with any of the material needs of the so-called unwashed. And most of that work was left to voluntary charitable groups, and there was a vast amount of charitable relief going on in 19th century London at this time. But what Ranyard saw predominantly was well-meaning outsiders who came into areas, as it were, delivered the charity and went home to their comfortable middle-class suburbs. Often, the act of charity itself ended up being disempowering and patronizing. And Ranyard saw all of this. She felt the need, and she remembered her friend. And what she saw was a wide open harvest field. A new kind of missional environment that required a new kind of approach. She watched, she observed, she listened, and then she began to devise a scheme. She focused her energy on agency. A scheme employing impoverished women, not destitute women, but ordinary working women, giving them a chance to earn extra money for their families by selling Bibles on a penny a week subscription basis to other poor women in their neighborhood. And Ranyard recognized that what working people needed more than anything else was other working people. They needed community. The cities were places of anonymity, of loneliness, of lack of any form of support. And she saw the need for friendship. And I want to highlight friendship as Ellen Ranyard's spiritual practice. We don't often talk about friendship as a spiritual practice, do we? But it takes time, it takes commitment, it takes habits of mutuality and communication to build strong, resilient friendships. And of course, the great enemy to that spiritual practice is the belief that we have better things to do with our time. Friendship. And what Ranyard did was she built a scheme that allowed women to form friendships with one another whilst at the same time learning to save up to buy a Bible, to release a new kind of dignity into an entire family unit, and from that family unit spreading out into the entire community. Because what dear old Ellen Ranyard realized was it's really the women who form the backbone of communities. She wrote, "They know I know their ways." That's a really important statement. They know I know. That's the opposite of being patronizing. They know I know how soup and bread and coal tickets and blankets too are changed away for gin, changed away by husbands with serious alcohol addictions. On two things they were all agreed. They all had bad husbands, I'm quoting, and they could not go to public worship for want of clothes. Isn't that tragic? They couldn't go to church because they didn't feel they had the right stuff. And actually, an alcohol addiction in a family set a basic working class family to the point of utter destitution. And it could happen just like that, where there were gin shops on the corner of pretty much every street in London in this time period. And they couldn't go to church because they didn't have the right stuff. It's an absolute indictment when the church becomes a safe haven for comfortable middle-class communities. That's an indictment. The Bible Society supplied Bibles to Ellen Ranyard, and she raised up women to sell these Bibles, paying them $1 a week, which was the equivalent of being able to rent a one-bedroomed space in Bermondsey in that time period. So it was enough to actually be a game changer in those women's lives. And she taught the women to sell the Bibles, but she also taught them to sew, to boil a broth, to change a nappy, to lay out the dead. Basic rudimentary nursing skills. So when those women went to buy a Bible, the idea was you buy a Bible and then you join a group of other people who've bought a Bible in your neighborhood. And there, together as a community, you read the Bible, but you also learn to sew. You also learn to boil a broth and change a nappy and lay out the dead. And actually what begins to happen over time by the 1850s is that these women, Ranyard's Bible women, through her London Bible and Domestic Female Mission, another Victorian undercover title, right, for world-changing people. By the 1860s, 1850s, these Bible women were called Bible nurses. in recognition of their practical work of care that they carried out in the community. Many of them were, by default, the local midwives. They were the people who went to help when somebody was dying, because they were reliable and they were also skilled. They had the basic skills that were desperately needed. They were trusted friends. Florence Nightingale, we all have heard of her, basically recognized as the founder of professional nursing. She learnt her work on the ground in London working with Ranyard's Bible women. That's where she learnt her work. Another woman influenced by her was William Morris's sister, Isabella Gilmore, but I'm not going to tell you about that. She was very influenced. You can ask me about that later. In 1869, it's just a taster for more of these little trails that go off into exciting transformation. 1869, the structures that Ranyard used to facilitate the work of Bible women were incorporated into the COS, that's the Charitable Organization Society, and they became the basis for the systematic relief of poverty in the City of London. The Charity Organisation Society was renamed the Family Welfare Association in 1946, and this was the basis for the organisational structure out of which NHS district nursing services were developed in 1947. Right? Mustard seeds grow into trees. When you're disappointed, get back on your horse. Right? Can you cope with another story? Yeah. Another person? Okay. One of the overseeing members of Ranyard's mission was, he sat on the board. Board people are like Victorian titles, right? On the outside, you might think, but underneath, they're deadly transformers of culture, or at least they can be. And this board member was Anthony Ashley Cooper, the 7th Earl of Shaftesbury. Here he is. Also president of Bible Society from 1851 to his death, 34 years later. When this man died in 1885, at the age of 84, a funeral service was held at Westminster Abbey very, very early in the morning, and along the route from Grosvenor Square, where he lived, to Westminster Abbey, thousands of people gathered. Costermongers, flower girls, road sweepers, shoe cleaners, factory hands, standing there with their caps under their arms to pay their respects to a man who had been their consistent champion for 60 years. The famous Baptist minister, Charles Haddon Spurgeon, wrote a eulogy 3 days later. During the past week, the Church of God and the world at large have sustained a very serious loss. We have, in my judgment, lost the best man of the age. Listen to this, Spurgeon. They called him narrow, and in this they bear unconscious testimony to his loyalty to truth. We shall not know for many a year how much we miss in missing him, how great an anchor he was to this drifting generation, and how great a stimulus he was to every movement for the benefit of the poor. He lived for the oppressed. He lived for London. He lived for the nation. He lived still more for God. Historians have been almost universal in saying that Lord Shaftesbury did more to improve the plight of the destitute than any other man in the history of this nation. They point to his work to outlaw child labor, to the famous 10 Hours Acts of 1833, to the Miners and Collieries Act of 1842, ended the practice of sending women and children down the mines. Shaftesbury's eyes were always turned north. Always turned north to the huge, sprawling industrial cities, the centres of the Industrial Revolution. To Manchester, to Birmingham, right here to Derby, where the effects of rapid, unregulated change were having the biggest impact on the most vulnerable members of society, including, for example, the young boys, chimney sweeps. He's known for that work, for housing reform, for education. The list of boards that this man sat on, just no comparison. But I think that if I met Lord Shaftesbury, I wouldn't have liked him very much. I feel kind of guilty about that. But he was not a very likable man. He was aloof. He was stubborn. He was quite overpassionate about his opinions. He was principled to the extreme, and he never, ever stopped working. And unlike our other two friends, our case studies, he worked at the centres of power. He was a member of the House of Commons from 1826, and then he was elevated to the Lords in 1851 when his father died, and he became the next Earl. And it's at the centre of power that he persisted in a rare and essential spiritual discipline. Proverbs 31, verse 8. Speak up for those who cannot speak for themselves, for the rights of all who are destitute. Speak up for those who cannot speak for themselves, for the rights of all who are destitute. This was the integrating endeavour of Lord Shaftesbury's life. What moved him were the powerless. What angered him were self-satisfied elites who benefited from the impoverishment of others. But unfortunately for Shaftesbury, which might be why he was sometimes quite bad-tempered, was he had to spend most of his life surrounded by the very people that he found most troubling. He spent his life largely on committees in Parliament. And politically, he placed emphasis on transforming the mentalities of elites by demonstrating to them their responsibility for those who are in need. To whom much is given, much shall be required. That was a watchword for Lord Shaftesbury. And for him, poverty, injustice, oppression, ignorance, they could not be allowed to coexist with an easy conscience. And he was like the goad, the stick, the one who said what nobody else wanted to say. He was the barometer of the nation. People have called him the conscience of the nation. And it's really not difficult to see why he wasn't very liked. But underneath his prickly exterior was a very sensitive spirit. A person whose profound empathy for those crushed in spirit came out of his own experience of pain. I just want to show you another picture of him, because I think it captures slightly different. Neglected children come in many forms. They don't all wear rags. And Shaftesbury's father was a politician by virtue of being an earl. Basically, there was nothing notable about that man. To his children, he was cruel. None of his children loved him, but they loved their mother even less. The daughter of the Duke of Marlborough, fourth daughter of the Duke of Marlborough, and she added almost complete absence to her cruelty. And Shaftesbury's biographer, GFA Best, says that Shaftesbury grew up without any experience of parental love. He rarely saw his parents, and when he did, he was actually terrified of them. For the first 11 years of his life, he lived in Richmond, and then he lived in Richmond in the summer, and then at 24 Grosvenor Square in the winters. And on the surface, it looked like a life of privilege. Anybody who a house in Richmond, a house in Grosvenor Square, that doesn't look like neglect or poverty, does it? But as a small child, he was left alone for extended periods of time. Actually, on a few occasions, he was left for nearly 4 days. Nobody thought to feed him or even give him any water. He was so cold at night without a fire in the nursery that he couldn't sleep for cold. And school was as bad as home. He went to Manor House in Chiswick Lane, and he writes, "The place was bad, wicked, filthy, and the treatment was starvation and cruelty. And the only affection that Shaftesbury had was from a servant, Maria Millis. And it was from this woman that Shaftesbury received his first sense of the love of God. Maria told him Bible stories. She taught him to pray. And when she died, when Shaftesbury was in his early teens, she gave him her only possession of any value, her watch. And for the rest of his life, Shaftesbury wore that watch every single day. In 1851, the census showed that there were over 1 million people in domestic service. For a household of 6 to 8 people, members of the family, you could reasonably expect there to be a servant, a range of servants, numbering as many as 100. So being a servant was a common job. It was a horrible job because it often involved having almost no control over your whereabouts at any given moment. You were at the beck and call of your employer in every sense. You had to leave your own home and join their place. I very much doubt that Maria Millis wanted to be a servant. And I don't think that she will ever have had any idea at all how significant her kindness to an awkward child, what that did for the nation. Mustard seed moments. You're going to get sick of me saying it. But they are the things that really count in life. Shaftesbury's faith continued to grow through his teens, especially while he was at Harrow School for the last 2 years of his education before he went up to Oxford. And by the time he went into political life in his mid-20s as the MP for Woodstock, he had his own steady faith, and it framed his perception of everything. His parents thought he was a fool when he didn't maneuver and negotiate and put himself forward for high office, which would have given him a salary which he actually really needed. And most of his parliamentary colleagues thought he was not only a fool, but an insane fool. You can have a sort of double whammy. They thought he was entirely mad because he was constantly refusing to be elevated to high office because he wanted to stay on the benches in order to have freedom for his conscience rather than being under the dictates of a political party. And for many, many years, the respect that came later was nowhere to be seen for Lord Shaftesbury. The same point again, you don't know that you're a hero. These things happen in the hidden place. Faithfulness happens in the hidden place. Now, he had a good wife. I could tell you all about her. She's really interesting. But basically, she shared his faith and she understood what he had to do at the centers of power without succumbing to the temptations of power. There's a lot that could be said about Shaftesbury, but I want to just tell you about one slice. And that's his work with the mentally ill. Now, we know a lot about Shaftesbury, but this is the piece of his work that we don't often talk about. Actually, most of the biographers of Shaftesbury pass that bit over. And yet, this work was both the hardest and the longest. He spent 60 years working to advocate for the humane treatment of the mentally ill. And this work was distressing, it was arduous, and it was largely unseen. And it was almost entirely devoid of any positive feedback loops. Nobody wanted to work with this group in society. Shaftesbury was really the forerunner when it comes to mental health. Now, we have to use the word lunacy. Lunatic is a really difficult word for us, isn't it? It's a difficult word. It was a difficult word then as well. Because what it carried was shame. What it carried was almost complete ignorance. What it carried was the belief that actually lunacy was the judgment of God. And it had to be contained in order to stop harm and contamination for the rest of society. And when Shaftesbury became involved in this work, the condition of lunatics in asylums was among the worst of all the human conditions around in this period. Violent and dangerous lunatics were confined, but they were chained up in solitude, often in the dark. That was believed to be an important element of, quote, treatment. They were often incarcerated in outhouses or cellars where they were treated with terrible brutality. And mad relations and misfits, they were scooped up out of sight. We've all read Jane Eyre, so we know about that. If you want to be an aspiring middle-class family and make a name for yourself in this society of flux and transition, then the last thing you need is a mad relative. So it's best to get them out of sight and out of mind. And Shaftesbury, his first speech to Parliament was on this topic. He supported a set of bills brought forward by Robert Gordon. Gordon's bills were passed. They were the first bills to be passed in 1828 and 1832 for some rudimentary protection of lunatics. But the thing is, without Shaftesbury's work behind the scenes, those bills would have been simply pieces of paper. In theory, they allowed inspectors to go into private asylums and report on the treatment of those who were of patients inside those asylums. But it was Shaftesbury who turned that principle from a piece of paper, as it were, into something which had bite, which had teeth. And what he did was he was responsible for setting up visiting committees across the country. Visiting committees, again, sounds Victorian, but what they were communities of practice. He gathered people, lawyers. He gathered pretty much everybody working in medicine who knew anything about lunacy. He gathered them into committees so that they could go and inspect. And what he did was lead from the front. He spent 2 years visiting every facility in the land. Many of the houses that he visited had never, ever been opened up to visitors before. And what he found was unimaginable cruelty. He actually called it, the word he used was repulsive. That's a very strong word. And the work he did was deeply harrowing. And he began to take a deep dislike for the owners of these asylums, because he realized very, very quickly that they had a vested interest in keeping people exactly where they were and to keep the income flowing. And so you know what he did? He started going to visit them with his committees in the middle of the night. On a Sunday afternoon, when he was least expected, so that they couldn't put on a good front. Speaking up for those who could not speak for themselves. Imagine spending 2 years of your life visiting every one of those facilities in the country. And he did it himself. Training up others as he did. He wrote reports, he read reports. He made it his goal to break the thick shell of silence, shame, and indifference that enveloped this issue. And the speeches that he made to the House on this topic were among his finest. They were balanced, they were clear, they were unapologetic, and they combined principle with application. Some people have the ability to see how a principle can be embodied. That's an anointed, God-given gift, to see that relationship. And Shaftesbury is one of those people. Let me quote from Hansard, 23rd of July, 1844. These unhappy persons are outcasts from all social and domestic affections of private life. They have no refuge but in the laws. You, he's addressing his colleagues in the House, you can prevent by the agency you shall appoint the recurrence of frightful cruelties. You can soothe the days of the incurable and restore many sufferers to health and usefulness. For we must not run away with the notion that even the hopelessly mad are dead to all capacity of intellectual and moral exertion. Quite the reverse. Their feelings too are painfully alive. Their condition appeals to our highest sympathies. And then he quotes from dear old Milton, they are majestic though in ruin. That's a great phrase. Majestic though in ruin. The image of God indelibly stamped on every human being, making them utterly valuable and completely equal. And what he does at the end of this motion, he said, this motion, he ended, is made on behalf of the most helpless, if not the most afflicted portion of the human race. Speech was so well received that the Home Secretary promised that they'll bring in another bill if Shaftesbury did all the work. And guess what? He did. He did. And he writes in his journal, prodigious work. That's Victorian for a mountain of work. Really boring work, actually. But he did it. He also writes, prodigious work. Oh, that I might prosper in this task and do something for those desolate and oppressed creatures. He did the work. He presented the bills to Parliament, 1845. He set up a lunacy commission, and he began to change the public conversation around lunacy, to demonstrate that it was an illness like any other illness, but one that needed very particular kinds of care and that required compassion rather than social ostracism. When he brought his bills to the House, he said something so extraordinary and very revealing. I just want to read it to you. Basically made the argument that every single one of us can suddenly and unexpectedly suffer from mental illness. Any single one of us. Here we are, sitting in deliberation today, imagine the House of Commons. Tomorrow, we may be subjects of this fearful affliction. Causes as slight apparently as they are sudden, varying through every degree of intensity, will do the awful work. The most exalted intellects, the noblest of affections, can leave nothing but sadness. And then this is a sentence which I want us to hear, because I think it's really significant. How frail is the tenure by which we hold all that is precious and dignified in human nature. How frail is the tenure by which we hold all that is precious and dignified in human nature. And that frail tenure requires people who will speak up for those who cannot speak for themselves. Shaftesbury knew what he was talking about. He understood his own capacity for mental illness. At times he felt that he was treading on a tightrope between sanity and insanity. But his brokenness, deep, deep brokenness, was the very thing that made him speak. His sensitivity of spirit equipped him for the task that God had given him. Basically, the legislation that Shaftesbury crafted is still the basic legislation framework for the treatment of the Mental Health Act was built on that. He built a foundation. And I think the question that we have to ask ourselves is, what are we building on that foundation? He said of this aspect of his work, there is nothing poetical about it. But he did it all the same. Three friends. Three people actually really just a lot like us. Three friends, three spiritual disciplines, spiritual practices. Reading the Bible, friendship, speaking up for those who cannot speak for themselves. And we've set those people against this backdrop of a molten moment. I really like that phrase, the malleability, molten moments. I feel like I wish that I could know everything that's going on all of your brains right now. What are some of the things that have struck you about these people, these friends? What are the phrases? What are the thoughts? If they were right here, right now, what would you want to be talking to them about? What do they provoke? What batons are they handing on? And as we kind of draw this to a close, I just wanted to give you a sense of some of the reflections that have been floating around in my mind as I've been preparing on this. I have been really struck by the way that each of them moved towards the malleable moment rather than seeing it as a threat. Because it's so easy to see change as a threat. And negativity hangs over our culture like a shroud. It's so hard to move towards those moments in faith. They didn't treat that vortex as a threat, but as an opportunity for creative and focused engagement. And I think I found myself wanting to ask myself the question, when I look, what do I see? When we look at our cities, what do we see? Faith is being sure of what we hope for and certain of what we don't see. But at the same time, we don't have to see it all at once. Because the weight of it would be too much for us. The weight of the glory of God would be too much for us. But the weight of the need would be too much too. And that's where these beautiful mustard seed moments come in. Because it is just reading with Bob. It is just going to that neighborhood and facilitating relationships. And when we do those things in faith, in hope, and in love, they endure. And I think the enemy wants to make it so complicated. But it's really very simple. The rhythm of faithful obedience. And those acts of obedience are crucial against the backdrop. These micro moments of obedience are crucial against the macro backdrop of times of change. Because we don't know where we're going. All we have is the voice of the shepherd. Right? All we have. We have the voice of the shepherd and he leads us, but we don't always know where we're going. And our faithful obedience in these molten moments are so powerful. They are far beyond what we can ask. They can lead to things that are far beyond what we can ask and imagine. So if we can concentrate on being faithful each day, God can turn those spiritual practices into these conduits. As I said at the beginning, conduits is the best word. That inner life of God bubbling up within us, conduits that can bring the life of God into every dimension of the world around us. We practice a rhythm over and over and over again. And we do it in community. All of these people set up communities of practice. They knew one another. They knew of one another's work. They inspired one another and they innovated in the cracks. I love being in this room, looking at the circle of all these different, exciting enterprises of faith. Because every one of them's working in a gap. Our society is cracking at the seams. And we're working in the gaps, and that's an emerging space. It's a creative space. We don't know what will happen with those spaces, but when we're faithful in them, God can do extraordinary things. And he can bring about a new form, a new pattern, a new way of being that will form the backbone of safety for the marginalized and the impoverished for this next time period. Let's stop thinking in 5-year chunks and let's start thinking in 100-year chunks. Because the evangelical revival took 100 years to get to a point of maturity in the British Isles. It got to the point of these architects of social change who asked not only, how can I be saved, but how then shall I live? Am I able to say one more thing? I'm very conscious of the time. The thing is, there are so many stories where this one came from. There are so many wonderful people we've got to know about because they will inspire us. But we started off with Jeremiah 6, didn't we? Stand at the crossroads and look. Ask for the ancient paths. Ask where the good way is and walk in it, and you will find rest for your souls. And you will find rest for your souls. And you will find rest for... It hit me this week. I've heard that phrase before. Matthew 11:28. Come to me, all you who are weary of all this work, prodigious work, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. My yoke is easy and my burden is light. We stand at the crossroads and we look. We ask where the good way is, and the good way is a person, the Lord Jesus Christ, who said of himself, I am the way. And the way we walk in that good way is with a yoke that he's already carrying, and he invites us to participate with him in his work in the world. And that's where we find rest. And that peace, that's going to be the infectious ingredient in our culture, in our restless, exhausted, unpeaceful culture.